Hi everyone, David Aragona and Craig Milkowski here taking a look at the DRF Saturday race of the day. It is the Grade 1 Pennsylvania Derby going 9 furlongs on the main track at Parx for 3-year-olds. Before Craig and I get into the body of the field though, let's take a look at this brief message.
Want to view free Formulator past performances for this race? Head to the Race of the Day page at DRF.com. Don't forget to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form YouTube channel and bet this card with DRF Bets.
Craig, let's take a look at the 11-horse field signed on for this Pennsylvania Derby. Epicenter, the division leader, not a member of this field, but it's probably good news for handicappers because it means we've got a pretty competitive affair to handicap at Parx on Saturday.
This is one of the deepest, strongest Pennsylvania derbies that I can remember, even without Epicenter. We have, if you made a list of the top 10 3-year-olds, you probably have 7 or 8 of them in this field. I guess $1 million will still draw a pretty strong crop, and that's what we got here. A very competitive race, and I think a great betting race as well.
Yeah, the two favorites on the morning line are listed as Cyberknife and Taiba, the latter of the two listed as the slight choice at 5-2 over Cyberknife at 3-1. But there are a lot of horses you can make a case for in this spot. Basically, every horse that's listed at about 12-1 or lower on the morning line, I think you can say some positive things about, has some license to win this race. So pretty competitive field signed on. It's going to be interesting to see how these 3-year-olds sort themselves out. Before we get into the main contenders, let's take a look at the Timeform US pace projector for this race. And not the easiest pace to read, Craig. If we don't have too many confirmed frontrunners in this field, I think the one that people would expect to go forward might be the number 6, We the People. He's shown in between Cyberknife and Taiba, two horses that do have speed but aren't necessarily need the lead types.
I would tend to agree. I don't think the pace projector has this one nailed. I think We the People will probably be on the lead. Yeah, I know Cyberknife did lead the Travers early, but I think that was a function of his post position. He was drawn inside. Wasn't a ton of other speed that day. So I think he's a horse that would be more content to rate a little bit off the pace like he did in the Haskell. And Taiba is shown in the front, but he's actually a horse who has just been in some races with a lot of fast paces. He's never actually led a race early. He was pretty close in his debut, a maiden win, but his 3-2 turn routes, he's mostly seems to prefer being off the pace a bit more.
Another horse that could be a wild card with regard to the pace is the number 3, Beat Doc. He's a long shot in this race that we're not going to talk about, but he did show speed when he broke his maiden 4 back at Keeneland, going the 9 furlong distance. He's one that could go forward from his inside post position. Well, Craig, let's start to take a look at some of these contenders, and I think a natural starting point would be the Grade 1 Travers, which was won so impressively by Epicenter because the 2nd and 3rd place finishers are coming out of that race into this Pennsylvania Derby. Let's take a look at that replay, and Cyberknife was the somewhat surprising early leader. He comes into the stretch on the lead. That is Zandon in behind him, covered in dirt, who's trying to make up his ground, his typical run from the back of the pack. I thought Zandon does well to make up ground in this race, but I understand people that say that he should have gotten by Cyberknife in the stretch.
I can see that. I know we've talked about him on our podcast in the past where I'm just not sure Zandon wants to go quite 1.25 miles. I think the turn back to 1.1 1/8 is better. I do think Cyberknife was very game. I had mentioned that it was a race I played and I kind of turned it off as I was visiting family with 1/8 of a mile to go, thinking that I had lost. And I was really surprised Cyberknife was able to hold second. But I do think that the change in distance will actually benefit Zandon here.
Yeah, Cyberknife, as you said, he's been really game in really not just the Travers, but his last 3 starts. He was a nose winner in the Matt Win 3 back, so game fending off Taiba in the Haskell 2 back. We're going to talk about that race a little bit more in just a bit. And then last time, as you said, holding off Zandon for 2nd in that Travers. Obviously, neither one was any match for division leader Epicenter, but Cyberknife, it seems like he's one that's really taken a step forward in the second half of the season. And Craig, talking about that pace projector, I think the benefit to Cyberknife is that he has that versatility. He can come from off the pace like he did in Haskell, but he can also use the tactical speed like last time. So I just think it makes him pretty dangerous as a logical contender in this race.
I would agree with that. Like I mentioned earlier, I think the inside draw is what kind of forced his hand into Travers. I think this is a much more comfortable spot where he could sit too wide, even tuck in behind horses. He's not going to be far back, I don't think, like he was in the Haskell. I think he'll be a little bit closer, but he doesn't have to be on the lead for sure.
As for Zandon, who we already talked about a bit, he did just miss getting up for second, failing to pass Cyberknife in the late stages of the Travers. I tend to agree with Craig, though, that 1.25 miles might be a little bit far for him. The slight turn back to 9 furlongs figures to work in Zandon's favor. And Craig, he would appreciate any pace that might develop up front.
Right now, I have a feeling we're going to get some, and he's already got that good inside position. We know that he's most likely going to be saving ground with Joel Rosario. And if you have a horse that you want making up ground late, I would have to imagine that 9 times out of 10, Joel Rosario is the guy you want on him. And he is going to need that pace, as you say, but it's not like he doesn't have tactical speed. He's not some plotter that drops way back in the field. He has shown that he can stay pretty close, even in the Jim Dandy. It was a small field, but he was just a length off the lead pretty early. So he's one who can kind of make his own trip despite being a late closer.
Well, we already talked about how game Cyberknife was in winning the Haskell 2-back. Let's take a look at the stretch run of that race as Cyberknife comes up the inside to fend off Taiba, who was out in the center of the racetrack. He's going to ultimately finish second in this race. Craig, I think the prevailing opinion coming out of this race by many racing fans was that Taiba was the best horse because he kind of lost position on the turn, had to come around rivals to almost get there, whereas Cyberknife stayed on the inside. But is that just kind of Taiba, that he's a horse that comes off the bridle a little bit early? Are we going to expect a different effort here?
He's definitely a horse you have to put the work in when you ride him. He seems like you just have to get into him early in the race, and he will give you that long, sustained run. He's also a horse that I'm not sure is really comfortable being inside. So if you're hoping that he's going to save ground and get a better trip, that's something that I wouldn't want to pin my hopes to. He's probably going to make that sweeping run, a long, grinding run, and I do think he'll be a little better. That was his first race since the Kentucky Derby. I'm sure he's a little more fit, a little tighter for this one. So it wouldn't surprise me if he turned the tables on Cyberknife.
Yeah, I'm not among those that thought that Taiba was much the best in the Haskell. I mean, it was very close at the end. I thought Cyberknife did a lot of good things. I thought Taiba did some good things in that race, but I didn't like the way he came off the bridle so early at about the half-mile pole. And when you watch his workouts, like I was talking about coming into the Haskell, it's the same story coming into this Pennsylvania Derby. He is just hard-ridden in all of his morning training. I mean, you see that the posted times in the PPs, they're very fast, as is typical for a Bob Baffert runner, but boy, does he have to be ridden hard in the morning to achieve those times. Maybe he's just that kind of horse that really needs to be hard ridden, as Craig was saying. But I don't know. I get a little bit scared with runners like that. And it does feel like he's going to take a lot of money in this race. Craig, let's take a look at a different prep, sort of a less prestigious prep for the Pennsylvania Derby that took place in West Virginia. It is the West Virginia Derby at Mountaineer. This one was contested over a sloppy track, and we've got a couple of contenders coming out of this race, actually 3. The top 2 finishers, though, I think are the ones that will take most of the money, those being Skippy Longstocking and We the People. Kind of similar to the races they respectively ran in the Belmont. They just finished 3rd and 4th that day. 1st and 2nd this time against slightly softer competition, with Skippy Longstocking once again getting the better of his rival.
It was slightly easier competition, as you mentioned, but this came back a pretty fast race. The speed figures earned by the top 2 in this race, Skippy Longstocking and We the People, stack up just fine with horses like Taiba, like Zandon, and also like the favorite in here, Cyberknife. Or second choice, Cyberknife. I do think this is a race where these 2 can be contenders. My one reservation about that would be it came over a sloppy track. They kind of ran away from the rest of the field. It was a big gap back to Simplication in 3rd, who's also in this field. But it's not like Skippy Longstocking hasn't run a fast race before. He did it in the Belmont Stakes when he was 3rd behind Mo Donegal. That has definitely proven to be a key race where all the horses coming out of it seem to be running very well. So I think he's dangerous in this spot.
Yeah, Skippy Longstocking reminds me of the kind of 3-year-old, almost like a will take charge that wasn't among the best during the Triple Crown season, but has just been steadily getting better and better. And I thought we saw kind of how good he's gotten last time in that West Virginia Derby. We talked a little bit about that speed figure, Craig. It was hard to pick it apart too much. I mean, it really stacked up with the other dirt routes of the day. It just came up an extremely fast race, and feels like Skippy Longstocking has been cycling up to that effort for a little while now. And I think he could be flying under the radar as an improved 3-year-old in this Pennsylvania Derby. Don't want to totally discount the horse that was second to him last time, We the People. He was a little bit disappointing to fade to fourth in the Belmont Stakes. Maybe he just didn't handle the 1.5-mile distance that day. But Craig, I guess we do have to question a little bit whether he's one that moved up on sloppy or sealed racetracks, because his 2 big performances did come over that kind of going.
Right. He has ran well on wet tracks, but his speed figure was fine in the Belmont. I just personally would have a hard time seeing him turn the tables on Skippy Longstocking, where he basically had things his own way. He set the pace on a sloppy track without any real pressure and just was no match for that one through the lane. He did run well to hold on for second, but if I'm making selections, it would be really tough for me to pick him over Skippy Longstocking unless you just thought he was going to get the easiest of easy leads, and I don't really think that's the case in here.
Craig, did you see any reason to give an excuse to simplification for his distant 3rd place finish in that West Virginia Derby? He was coming off a layoff that day. I know his connection said that he might have been a little bit short for that race, but he's going to really have to step forward to turn the tables on the 2 that beat him, as well as some others that finished ahead of him earlier in the season.
Right. He ran okay. I guess the one excuse you could give him would be the sloppy track, but they were just running away from him through the stretch. He's a horse who hasn't quite run as fast as several others in here. That Mountaineer, West Virginia Derby at Mountaineer was his best speed figure on the Timeform US scale. But for me, it's hard to see him turning the table on those and still being able to hold off some of the others in here as well.
Let's discuss a pair of runners coming out of a different Derby from the summer months. That was Tawny Port and White Abarrio, who met in the Ohio Derby at Thistledown back in June. And Craig, Tawny Port, another 3-year-old that seems like maybe he's taken a step forward since the Triple Crown races. He just ran the best race this day as he runs down White Abarrio, as well as Classic Causeway, who did some nice things on turf since then. But Tawny Port could be heading in the right direction for Brad Cox.
Right. He's run 120 plus speed figures the last 2 times. He's always kind of been underrated a little bit. He even ran pretty well in the Kentucky Derby. It's hard to say he was close to the pace when he was 10, 11 lengths back early, but that was a lot closer than some of the other horses. And he was only beaten 4 lengths that day. And he's one who just seems to show up and run his race every time. I do think he would have to make another step forward, but his race in the Jim Dandy was pretty good. It's not like he was embarrassed by Epicenter and Zandon. He was only 2 lengths behind.
And White Abarrio, who was second in that Ohio Derby, ran pretty well that day. But Craig, what happened last time in the Haskell? I watched that race back. It just seemed like he lacked some early speed and never got involved. It's tough to win a race like the Pennsylvania Derby, especially one that's come up this tough off such a poor performance.
I wouldn't want to bet him. You would have to have faith that Saffie Joseph can get him back to the form we saw in Florida early this year or even the Ohio Derby. He draws a bad post in here, sort of like he did in the Haskell as well. He wound up 4 wide around the first turn, which is always a bit of an excuse, particularly when the pace is solid. But I don't think it was enough of an excuse to dismiss him getting beat by 34 lengths that day. He's not for me in here, but if you have faith, you can just put a line through that race. I could see it because he's probably going to be bigger than that 8-1 price I see on the morning line.
Yeah, I'd be surprised if he was the shorter price of the 2 Saffie Joseph runners in this race. I expect them to flip-flop a little bit. And speaking of that, let's throw up our picks for this race. And Craig and I both like that other Saffie Joseph runner a little bit, maybe me a little bit more as we flip-flopped our top picks here. I put Skippy Longstocking on top. As I was saying just before, I think he's improving in the second half of the season. Seems like he's maintaining good form coming into this race, showing some bullet 58 and change workouts up at Saratoga. And I think we're going to see another solid effort from Skippy Longstocking. And given the star power in this race, I still do think he's going to be a fair price. But Craig, I've got no problem with your pick of number 1, Zandon. Just feels like he's a horse that's going to appreciate the slight turn back.
I don't think this is a race where you really want to be playing the favorites in here. So I've got no problem with skipping long stocking. It's a race where I may very well bet 2 horses in here, and it would be those 2. We'll definitely play some exactas because I think it's one the public might get a little confused and not know where to go. I have a feeling I think Taiba is going to run well, but I don't think he's going to be any value at all as a horse who's probably going to wind up favored in here. And I'm going to go in a different direction. And I'm sure Zandon, if he were a person, would be happy to go to the gate and not see Epicenter standing in there with him. Good to get away from him. And I'm just looking for a little better performance from him at the shorter distance.
Same exact for Craig and I, just different order in the Grade 1 Pennsylvania Derby on Saturday at Parx. Good luck if you're playing the races this weekend.